You wake in the dark, and the first thing you notice is your feet. Not cold, numb, the flat, rubbery, nothing that shows up right before frostbite takes your toes for good. There's no wall between you and the wind, just a stretched hide flapping at the edge of a shelter your family built with their own hands. No pantry, no thermostat, no hospital down the road if this goes wrong. Somewhere close, an ember is dying, and nobody here can promise they know how to bring fire back from nothing. This isn't a bad camping trip. This is an ordinary night, repeated for tens of thousands of years, somewhere in the coldest stretch of the last ice age our species ever had to live through. Here's the uncomfortable part. Drop you into that same night with everything you currently know, and you'd likely be dead before the ice sheet outside even noticed you'd arrived. Not because you're stupid, because staying alive here was never about knowledge in the moment. It was about work finished months earlier, in the sun, when it still felt unnecessary. Start with the obvious problem. Your skin. Humans have no fur thick enough to matter and no layer of blubber, just bare skin built for the African savanna. For a long stretch, the fix was simple and half-broken. Kill something with fur, drape the hide over your shoulders, hope. It wasn't enough. Wind finds every gap in a draped skin, and it slides off exactly when you need it most, reaching for firewood, crossing open ground. In real cold, exposed skin doesn't just ache. It dies quietly. Fingertips first, then the nose, then the ears, turning black and staying that way. Somebody watched that happen to a person they loved and decided a draped hide wasn't good enough anymore. That wasn't a fashion upgrade. That was grief, turning itself into engineering. The fix came from something almost embarrassingly small. A splinter of bone or ivory, ground down by hand until it held a point on one end and a hole barely wider than a hair on the other. Drilling that hole took the kind of patience most of us have lost, turning a stone bit against bone for hours, knowing one wrong twist would snap the whole thing and waste the work. But that tiny hole changed everything downstream of it. For the first time, hides could be cut into shapes and stitched into something that actually matched a human body, sealed at the wrists, trapping warm air against the skin no matter how hard the wind pulled at it. A needle smaller than your finger is a serious contender for the single object that let people live somewhere the sun barely bothered showing up. Fire made survival possible, but fire is fragile. For most of this era, we can't say for certain people could reliably summon it from nothing. So groups didn't remake fire, they carried it. A single glowing coal, insulated in damp moss, nursed along for hours while someone walked it across open, frozen ground. On a bad day, somebody's entire job was sitting still and feeding that one ember just enough air to survive, without ever letting it flare up and burn out too fast. Lose focus for an afternoon, and your people face the night with no light, no warmth, and no way to cook the one meal you found. The most important person in camp that day wasn't the strongest hunter. It was whoever had the patience to keep a dying coal alive. Some of the coldest ground our ancestors tried to live on had no timber and no usable stone for miles, so they built with the only heavy material lying around, the bones of animals too big to ignore. Ribs and skulls stacked in interlocking rings, a single curved tusk marking where you ducked inside, dozens of separate skeletons combined into one continuous wall. Bone doesn't lock together like wood, so every crack got sealed by hand afterward. Stretched hide pinned across the gaps, turf packed against the outside, snow banked up on purpose, because trapped snow holds air, and trapped air holds heat. Falling asleep every night inside the ribs of something that could have fed your whole family for a month wasn't eerie to them. It was just what a house was. Cold wasn't the cruelest threat here. Hunger was. Real winter shuts down the land itself. Plants die back, animals thin out or disappear, and the ground turns to stone too hard to dig. So survival came down to a bet placed months earlier, when the sun was still out and storing food felt almost unnecessary. Meat got cut into strips and smoked until there was no moisture left for anything to rot in. Fat got rendered into a small, dense ration that could carry someone through a brutal stretch on almost nothing else. And wherever the ground itself froze solid, people dug straight into it, turning winter's own cold into a freezer against winter. Get that bet wrong in October, and nobody found out with a bang. They found out quietly, in February, when somebody simply didn't wake up. Here's the part usually left out. Most of them didn't make it. Genetic evidence shows human populations across Ice Age, Europe, and Asia went through brutal bottlenecks, stretches where numbers dropped so low that entire family lines simply stopped, with nobody left to carry them forward. Researchers still argue over exactly why. The cold snaps themselves, disease, plain starvation, or the bad luck of being a small, isolated group when the climate turned. And that argument isn't settled. What is settled is this. You aren't descended from every group that tried to survive that winter. You're descended only from the ones who got every decision right. The coat, The fire, the shelter, the food, generation after generation, without a single fatal mistake. That's not a guaranteed inheritance. That's a filter. And most people who ever lived didn't pass through it. So what actually separated the bands who made it from the ones who vanished? Not strength, not raw toughness. It was reach. Archaeologists keep digging up beads, shells, and stone tools nowhere near where they were actually made. Separated from their origin by a journey most of us would never attempt on foot, passed from one group to a group they'd never met, long before anyone had a reason to expect the favor returned. That reach meant a starving band could show up at a stranger's fire in the worst year of their lives and be given a share instead of turned away. It may have mattered more than fire, more than the needle, more than the shelter. It just looked less impressive, so it never made the highlight reel. Tonight you'll probably decide your apartment feels a little cold, reach for a thermostat, and never think about any of this again. That's not a failure on your part. That is genuinely the outcome they were fighting for. Every dial you turn without a second thought, every shelf stocked with food in the dead of winter, exists because thousands of generations solved the code, kept the coal alive, sealed the shelter, won the arithmetic, and let strangers in instead of shutting them out. None of them got here by being fearless. They got here by trying again the next morning, and then the one after that for 10,000 winters in a row.